when we got together as a team of authors, we tried not to be another echo chamber where authors amplify each other's voices and perspectives, but we chose each other to complement each other. So some of us look at the macro level, some at the meso level, and some at the macro level. And this is the contribution of our book to research on data for accountability purposes.
In Chapter 2, I trace emphases on accountability and responsibility in education reforms around the world. I do this using the World Education Reform Database, which is a publicly available resource that has descriptions of close to 15,000 education policies from countries around the world. So a key finding of the chapter is that as datafication intensifies from the mid-2000s on, emphases on responsibility fall off dramatically in education policies. In contrast, emphases on accountability continue to increase. A key implication is that datafication contributes to the hollowing out of notions of responsibility for education outcomes.
In this chapter, I examine how large-scale assessments and related accountability policies evolve in educational systems. As several chapters in the book show, accountability and assessments have spread widely in education, but their design and trajectory vary quite significantly. And perhaps more importantly, they also change continuously within the same educational system over time. So the central question I ask is, what explains different accountability configurations and pathways beyond obvious common reform pressures? To explore this, I adopt an instrumentation perspective. This is a theoretical perspective that focuses on three main dimensions. The first one is the framing of the policy problems that instruments are expected to address. Second, how do new instruments interact with existing policies and produce new policy mixes? And third, how policy feedback loops and instrument constituencies become key mechanisms in shaping policy trajectories. In fact, one of the contributions of this chapter is developing this framework. Empirically, I apply the framework to the cases of performance-based accountability in Chile, Norway, and Catalonia. And I show how the different components of the instrumentation framework interact and effectively shape policy pathways in the three systems.
My chapter looks at the transfer that is rarely discussed, the transfer from ministries of finance to ministries of education. We always think that all education reforms start in our sector, but we forget that many reforms started out as a public administration reform and then were handed over to line ministries, including ministries of education. And when we take it one level up to the macro level, we can see how the OECD and the World Bank were really instrumental in spreading those reforms. Not only ministries of finance reforms or public administration reforms, but then also education reforms. And this is what my chapter contributes to this book.
The chapter I wrote in this book examines reforms associated with public accountability with a particular focus on assessments. We coded over 15,000 national education reforms from the World Education Reform Database, which was developed by our research team at Stanford University and the University of Toronto. The main argument of this paper is that assessments are an indispensable and influential component of reform efforts, affecting student learning, teacher performance, education planning, and strategic directions of national education systems. I'd like to highlight some key findings of this paper. First, we observe a rise in assessment reforms relative to other types of education reforms. The study also reveals that topology of assessment reforms have changed over time. There are also assessment reforms that reference other countries through rankings and knowledge exchanges. Also, there's greater reference to assessment reforms associated with students and teachers. This reveals that there's greater standard setting and oversight of student competency and teacher performance over time.
And I present chapter 6 of this book. Building on the overall focus of the book on data for accountability, this final chapter looks at intergovernmental organizations and how they contribute to the field of education. Let me highlight 3 main points. First, out of 350 IOs currently around, 30 of them deal with education policy today. While UNESCO, the OECD, or the World Bank are widely known as education IOs, the majority of them, namely 20, work on a regional level. Second, this number of IOs dealing with education policy has continuously grown since 1945, but plateaued at its current height in the early 2000s, actually very similar to IOs active in other policy fields. And third, all these IOs try to influence the global or regional discourses on education through policy documents, but only very few of them have other tools such as binding conventions or funding mechanisms at their disposal.